Hey everyone, thanks for joining me today for episode 627 of People Behind the Science. I'm your host, Dr. Marie McNeely. This week we are excited to be rebroadcasting our interview with Dr. Michael Dickinson, originally published on January 12th of 2015. Listeners, Michael has made important contributions to our understanding of insects' flight control systems as well as sensory processing through his research on the fruit fly Drosophila. His work incorporates a wide variety of scientific disciplines, such as physiology, aerodynamics, neuroscience, and biomechanics, to provide a comprehensive understanding of these areas. He is well known for developing a robotic fly model, as well as using other tools such as wind tunnels, virtual reality simulators, and high-speed video to study how fruit flies can rapidly control flight. And beyond just shedding light on insect flight, his work has provided valuable insights into our basic understanding of complex biological systems, signaling within the brain, the dynamics of unsteady fluid flow, and other areas. So listeners, sit back, relax, and get ready for another episode of People Behind the Science.
Every day, discoveries are made that will change our understanding of the world around us. Dr. Marie McNeely is here to bring you the brilliant minds who are making these discoveries so they can share their incredible stories and take you on an amazing journey. Welcome to People Behind the Science.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of People Behind the Science. I am excited to be here today with Dr. Michael Dickinson. So welcome to our show today, Michael. How are you?
I'm fine. It's a beautiful sunny day here.
Well, I'm jealous. We've got a little bit of clouds here, but it's great to chat with you today. Now, listeners, Michael is the Abe and Esther Zarem Professor of Bioengineering at California Institute of Technology. He received his PhD in zoology from the University of Washington and afterwards worked briefly at the Max Planck Institute for Biological Cybernetics in Tübingen, Germany. Michael has received numerous awards and honors during his career, including the Larry Sandler Award from the Genetic Society of America, the Bartholemew Award for Comparative Physiology from the American Society of Zoologists, a Packard Foundation Fellowship in Science and Engineering, a MacArthur Foundation Fellowship, as well as the Quantrell Award for Excellence in Undergraduate Teaching from the University of Chicago. He is also a Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Now, Michael is here with us today to tell us all about his journey through life and science. So today, Michael, we are thrilled to get to know you, both as a scientist, but also as a person. So can you take a few minutes here to tell us what you like to do with your time when you're not doing science?
Well, I should say that I've just moved into a brand new office that has nothing but a telephone, a laptop, and a ukulele.
Oh, wow.
That gives you some sense of my priorities in life. So I enjoy music. I played the guitar for many years, not particularly well, but about 10 years ago, I picked up the ukulele and I enjoy it a lot. I try to mostly play jazz standards and, that sort of genre. So that's how I spend a lot of my time when I'm not with my family, my kids. I have a 10-year-old daughter and a 7-year-old son, and they take up a lot of my time. I also love gardening, and living here in Southern California, I'm a big advocate of native gardening. So much to the horror of my neighbors, I ripped out our lawn and replanted it. For years, it looked like a bad model train setup with these little tiny bitty plants. But over the years, it's grown into a lovely garden. And my wife and I both like vegetable gardening and, like the outdoors in general when it's not too hot.
Certainly. Well, great to hear about how you spend your time when you're not at work. So can you tell us, with this interest in gardening, did you have a prize crop of sorts this year?
Well, because we were moving this year, we didn't really have too much of an opportunity to garden through the summer. But in the spring, up in Seattle, we had a great crop of peas. It's a wonderful climate for peas. And I'm looking very much forward to planting the fava beans for our fall and winter crop here in Pasadena.
Wonderful. Well, great to hear about your gardening, your agriculture skills there. And the ukulele, I think that is a fantastic thing to have in an empty office. So how did you get interested in the ukulele to begin with? What drew you to that instrument in particular?
Fate, I think. Actually, I was with my family in Hawaii and we were driving down the street, and I think my wife can back me up on this. I am not an impulsive buyer. I wear the same 6 shirts I've had for, 12 years.
Right.
But this was just this weird situation where I was just driving down the street. I saw the ukulele shop out of the corner of my eye. I pulled over and I told everybody in the family, okay, just wait here. I'll be back in 10 minutes. And I came back with the ukulele. And well, from a practical perspective, it fits in an overhead bin quite easily. So it's an easy instrument to travel with. Actually, I think I heard Jake Shimokiburo say this once, but I'm happy to repeat the sentiment that when a guy picks up a guitar in a room, half the men in the room are looking at him saying, I'm sure he's not as good as me. And the other half, I hope he's not as good as me. I mean, it's this whole horrible machismo that goes around guitars. Whereas ukulele, if you pick up a ukulele, everybody expects you to be pathetic. And so, the expectations couldn't be lower. What's the joke about perfect pitch is when, you throw the ukulele in the dumpster and it hits the banjo. So, it's kind of a great instrument because if you can show even the modest amount of acumen, you've exceeded all the expectations in the room. So
that is a great reason. I might have to go get myself a ukulele then. I could be mildly proficient at ukulele, I think. Well, that is great to hear about how you got interested in this particular instrument, and wonderful to hear a little bit more about you personally. We're going to dive next into the world of science. So can you tell us, Michael, how do you describe what you do at work to someone who might not be in science?
Yeah, I knew that's your number one question, and already I'm going to make it complicated. So I sort of lived a double life in science. On one hand, my work has focused on sort of the biomechanics, the biophysics of life. And so what I often say when people ask me what I do is I say, well, I study how animals fly, which is true. And I found that some people are just not going to be interested at all, but some people have always wondered when they have seen a bird flying through the sky or, an insect buzzing by. So it's usually a pretty good way to get people interested in, some aspect of biology that they have personal experience with, because we all see flying animals. But on the other hand, sometimes when I feel more like I'm a neuroscientist, I say, well, I study how brains work. And then I sort of let people decide whether they're interested in that because they're interested in humans, or they might have a relative who has autism or something like that. And then sometimes I slowly sort of leak it to them that I'm actually most interested in little tiny brains,
right?
Which either appeals to some people, it doesn't appeal to everybody. So I know this is a complicated answer to a rather simple question.
Well, I think it's great that you have this almost multifaceted approach to be able to talk about flight. I think you're absolutely right there. It's something that a lot of people can relate to and, really envy. It's something that a lot of animals do quite well that humans, we aspire to fly, right? So that is a fantastic way to introduce it. And I think talking about the brain, a lot of people get excited at a basic level and can relate it to something, like you said, a relative who has a disease of sorts, or just have a basic knowledge within that general realm. So interesting that you have these approach and you study what's basically at the intersection of these things, with the behavior, with the neuroscience. So great way to approach it. Now, we'll chat more about some of the research that you're working on in your lab a little bit later in the interview, but I'd like to start off with asking not only what you do, but what motivates you to do what you do. I know a lot of scientists spend so much time doing the research, it's often hard to balance everything else in their life. So I'd like to chat about if you have a motivational quote or maybe a saying that keeps getting you through the day.
I have something I think about that gets me through the day, or I should say keeps me in check. Unfortunately, it's not a pithy quote, but it's basically a strive for self-honesty. I'm a huge advocate of self-honesty. And what I mean by that is sort of being acutely aware of one's limitations and being accepting of them, and also being acutely aware of one's talents and strengths. And in science, and I got to say outside of science, I strive to be honest with myself and what I do. And I emphasize strive because I think it's a very difficult state to achieve. I think we're always telling ourselves stories. We're always, whether it's, buying a car, we're convincing ourselves that, it was the best car to buy. Or
right, of course.
If we decide to work on a particular problem, we're trying to convince ourselves that, it's the most fascinating problem in all of science. And I find it very useful to sort of always be questioning myself, my motives, and, striving to live in a self-honest way.
Certainly. Well, I think that is a fascinating outlook to really have a good sense of what you're great at, what your strengths are, as well as your weaknesses, your limitations. And I think you're absolutely right when you're describing this, situation, the human condition almost. It's a challenge to achieve this self-honesty, but also to maintain it, because every day you're basically convincing yourself, I think in a lot of cases, that this is the best way. This is maybe a bad way, different decisions that you're making every day. So really interesting to hear about one of these motivational factors, or at least one of these things that you keep in the back of your mind as you go through life. Now, can you tell us next, Michael, about some of the people who you've encountered, who you've worked with over the years, who might have inspired you or motivated you and served as role models?
Sure. I think of the people I worked with, certainly Carl Goetz, who was a director of the Max Planck Institute in Tübingen, where I worked briefly, was a great motivational figure for me. And there's some people in science who I've never worked with who I find very inspiring. Yves Marder, who is a professor of neuroscience at Brandeis University, is certainly high on that list. There's people I've never met whose work I read when I was becoming or trying to become a scientist. Ken Roeder was a British-trained engineer. He never got his PhD, but he eventually became a professor at Tufts. And he was really a genius for applying engineering and mathematics skills to study animal behavior and animal physiology in a way that was very inspiring to me when I read a book he wrote while I was an undergraduate. Vince Detier is another person sort of in the same category, a fly physiologist who did a lot of work in the 50s and 60s, whose fascination for fly behavior for the sake of behavior, not just because it's a model for something else. And I found that very inspiring. And I have to say, because of my interest in gardening, Frederick Law Olmsted is another sort of one of my heroes. I read a biography of Olmsted by Witold Brzezinski, and I found it absolutely sort of inspiring and fascinating.
So what was Olmsted's story that really inspired you, or what aspect of his career in life?
Two things I'd say. One is that, something I may get to later, I guess it could go along with the, what I tell myself motivationally. I sort of believe in living outside the comfort zone, always pushing yourself to do something new. And Olmsted, when he died, all the obituaries were about his work before the Civil War as a correspondent. He was known as a reporter, and his move to landscape architecture was something he did later in life and was completely different than, what most people knew him for. So anyway, that ability to have the courage to do something completely different, I found fascinating about Olmsted. And then there's something about landscape architecture that requires a view of the future that I think is very profound. The ability to, plant these little tiny seedling trees and envision what it's going to look like in 100 years, 50 years after you're dead.
Right.
And I think that of all the skills that humans have, it's the least exercised. I think we react to the immediate, and people who can plan for the future, I think they're really valuable members of our culture. So more than anything else, I think that's what I find so inspirational about Olmsted. And, whether it's walking through Central Park or the Emerald Necklace or many of the wonderful public spaces throughout the country, we owe this huge debt to his vision.
Certainly. Well, it is great to hear about some of these people who really inspired you. And I think you've made so many great points here. And in particular, talking about the last person, Olmsted here, just the importance of the ability to see the potential of small things in the future. So I think that has great applications if you extrapolate it out to science as well. So fascinating to hear about some of these people that you've looked up to. And now I'm curious, Michael, about where your interest in science began. Can you take us all the way back to your very first, perhaps, memory of being excited about something related to science, and tell us a little bit about some of the key moments along your journey that really got you to where you are today, studying what you're studying?
Sure, I can try. I mean, I think like a lot of kids in my generation, I was sort of a latchkey kid growing up. So I spent a lot of time in front of the television. And I loved all of those old National Geographic shows. I mean, this is back before cable, and it was all network TV. But the Jacques Cousteau specials, the Jane Goodall specials. I grew up in downtown Baltimore. I was not surrounded by nature by any means, but I remember gravitating towards those programs. And I was kind of a fat and pimply kid. I wasn't at all adept at anything outdoorsy or athletic, but I really gravitated. I remember wanting to be a marine biologist, wanting to learn to scuba dive. Another pretty important event is when I was also probably in early middle school, perhaps, my father, who is still an Episcopalian minister, he took me to the Enoch Pratt Library where they showed the 13 episodes of Jacob Bronowski's The Ascent of Man, which I know is a horrible terminology in today's, but that's what it was called back then, The Ascent of Man. But basically, it was a history of sort of human progress, and particularly in science. And I just remembered thinking it was absolutely fascinating. And I certainly owe my father for that experience. Then, in terms of journey, I always liked science. I always was good at it in school, but it wasn't at all what I wanted to be. I mean, for most of my childhood, I wanted to be an artist. You know, as we all have these little identities in school, whether you're the best violinist or you can speak 5 languages or whatever it is. And I was the art kid. I was the kid who did these like very, very detailed drawings, and you would spend all this time in the art studio. And I ended up leaving high school early for a number of personal reasons. And, you know, with the hope going and becoming a visual artist. And it didn't take me long. You know, it was a little bit of a mistake because I was pretty young when I, went to college. I realized very quickly that I wasn't good enough. I wasn't even close to good enough. I didn't have the confidence. So maybe this gets back to the whole self-honesty thing. I mean, I realized that I didn't have the graphic skills. I didn't have the experience, the confidence. And so I consider myself a pretty big failure a year and a half into college. And I really flitted around trying to find something to do. And it was really a fellow named Charles Lent, who sadly has passed away. He taught a class in behavioral neurobiology or neuroethology. And I just sort of took it for, no good reason. And it was a pretty fast click that, this is something that I really just find absolutely fascinating. And then, within a few months, I was working in his laboratory, and within a few weeks, I was sticking glass electrodes in the brain cells of leeches and doing all sorts of experiments with them, and then spent most of my college years in a lab doing experiments. So I made a very rapid transition from failed artist. I can't even say I was a failed wannabe, failed artist wannabe.
You can't fail until you really do it, right?
Yeah, exactly. To practicing scientist.
That is a fascinating story. I think really interesting to hear about how you had this inherent interest in science and nature. So I must ask, did you ever end up learning how to scuba dive?
No, I never did. I have gone snorkeling, and in about a month, I am going to make it to the Great Barrier Reef and do some snorkeling there, but I never managed to take this scuba training.
Gotcha. Well, there's still time, still plenty of time. So I think it's always interesting to hear about what people wanted to be as a kid. And I think a lot of scientists today look back at people like Jacques Cousteau, look back at Jane Goodall, some of these people who really inspired them in their early years and the people who they wanted to be when they grew up. So interesting to hear about this fascinating detour that you took through art, becoming interested in that. That's what you were planning on pursuing in college, and then how rapidly things kind of turned around based on this one class that you took to then being interested in science. So fascinating to hear about what got you started on this path. Can you tell us a little bit more next about one of these projects that you are working on now that you are the most excited about?
That's hard, only because there's a bunch of projects that I'm working on, or I should say the people in the lab are working on that I'm excited about. But I'll certainly tell you about one that is up there, and it needs a little bit of a setup. So I think as someone who's very interested in behavior and how brains control behavior, it's very frustrating that, like all neuroscientists, what I study, what we really all study are like little tiny components of behavior, little tiny reflexes, whether it's a monkey responding to a flow of dots in a screen in front of them, or a fly responding to a puff of odor, or a bird singing a song. But, when we think of behavior, just this conversation, for example, it's very, very, very long sequence of things. we're talking back and forth. I had to get out my computer and I'm taking notes. And that's what behavior is. I mean, so if you think back of what you would see in a Jane Goodall movie about the chimpanzees or the gorillas, these animals do long sequences of things. And the old, why did the chicken cross the road? Like any little element of it, why did the chimp reach up to get another banana leaf at that moment? We don't understand this. We don't understand how the brain generates these super, super complicated sequences, taking in information and also integrating what their bodies are telling them at that moment and so forth. So that's the broad thing. So in flies and mosquitoes, we've been in the lab studying how they find food, how, a little fruit fly can fly for kilometers across an open desert and find, a little tiny piece of rotting food that it can eat. It can find flies to mate with and so forth, where a mosquito can fly through the forest and find a host to suck blood. And how does it do this? How does it complete that very, very critical sequence? And for years, like other people, we've studied how insects use odor to find these sources of food. But eventually, they have to land on a thing, right? A mosquito lands on us, right? A fruit fly lands on a little tiny spot of fruit. And recently, we found that the way they see the world, the way these animals see and respond to the world, is changed by what they smell. So in fruit flies, if you fly them in sort of a giant virtual room, it's hard to describe, but they'll fly around. And if you give them little tiny spots, or little fruit-shaped objects, they'll completely ignore them as if they never see them. But you give them one puff of ethanol, which is sort of one of their favorite odors because it's produced by the fruit they're looking for, the rotting fruit they're looking for, all of a sudden they'll become interested in these small visual targets.
Interesting.
And mosquitoes exhibit basically an almost identical behavior. And so to me, it is a way of getting at this problem of how complicated sequences of behavior put together, because I think what's going on is that the acquisition of one sensory cue, odor, it changes the connectivity of circuits within the brain. And now the animal is responding to the world in a very, very, very different way. And now these little tiny small objects, which it completely ignored before, it just zooms in like a laser. And to me, this is sort of maybe will give us the opportunity to get at what I think is sort of the secret of how brains, particularly small brains, work, that they're multitasking in time and space, so that they're doing one kind of computation and then something happens to them and they're doing another kind of computation, and then something happens and they're doing yet another computation. So they're not these static entities, but rather they're sort of transforming their own physiology over time. And I think that's how these little brains the size of a salt grain can generate so much complicated behavior. And we're calling it odor-induced visual salience, which is sort of a boring way to describe it. But effectively, this mechanism by which what an animal smells transforms how it sees the world and what visual objects are attractive is a good way at getting at this problem.
Certainly. Well, I think this is a really interesting project. As you were describing it, I think as humans, we're so visually dominant. We depend so much on what we see that it's almost hard for us to imagine the complexity of the different sensory stimulation, how the systems are even set up for other animals who might be depending more heavily on other senses, like the odorants, as you're describing. So that is a really fascinating project. Now, interesting to hear about some of the work that you're doing now. And we've talked a little bit about your journey as a scientist in terms of all the great things that have really happened along your journey. And we haven't yet chatted about some of the struggles and some of the challenges that I know every scientist faces. So, Michael, I'm going to ask you to go back and think about your career and some of these tough times that you've faced, maybe a struggle or a major failure that you've had, and how you got through it.
That is the easiest question you've ever asked me. I mean, my career is completely polarized or defined, I think is the more appropriate word, defined by a sort of catastrophic failure. So when I left graduate school, I did a postdoc at the Roche Institute for Molecular Biology outside of New York in Nutley, New Jersey. It doesn't exist anymore, but it was a basic research institute that was run by Hoffman LaRoche. And I was working in a laboratory on the phenomenon called long-term depression, which is very appropriate for this point in my life. What it means to a neuroscientist is it's a change in the strength of synapse in the brain over time. And I was working with neurons from mice. And this is after having done a dissertation on sort of the development of the nervous system in fruit flies. And it was just absolutely hard. For whatever reasons, I didn't get along with my advisor very well. I don't think he liked me very much. It was just clearly the wrong project, the wrong lab, just everything about it was horrible. And this was my opportunity. I was trying to enter more mainstream neuroscience and working on a problem. And this problem really had to do, again, with how synapses change over time and the role of calcium in that process. And after 14 months of this, I was ready to leave science, even though at the time I had gotten a job. So I had a job to go to at the University of Chicago, but I wanted to give up. I mean, it was just absolutely hard. It had taken all the winds out of my sails. And it's a cliche, but it's an apt one. So how did I get out of it? So when I was a graduate student for a month, I had gone to Germany to work at this Max Planck Institute to do some experiments that my advisor thought I could really only do there because it was a very unique place. And I had gotten along with one of the directors, this fellow Carl Goetz. And it's another story, which I wouldn't have time to tell. And during that first trip, I had lost all my clothes because they never made it off the plane. And I had to wear Carl Goetz's clothes. And I dyed all of his underwear bright pink because I couldn't understand how to use washing machines. But anyway, that's another story. But he was an extremely kind fellow. And at the end of that visit, he said, "Oh, Michael, it's so wonderful to have you here. And, if you ever want to come back, just let me know." And so after 14 months of this horrid postdoc, it was before sort of email, I basically wrote him a letter and said, "Remember when you said if I ever wanted to come back, how's next week look?" And basically within a month, I was on a plane to Germany, and Carl kind enough to figure out a way to just pay me for 6 months to do something. And then the question was, what the heck was I going to do?
Right.
And that's when I made this decision to, in consultation with Carl, to tackle this problem of how flapping wings make aerodynamic forces. So it was something I had no training in. I was not a fluid mechanist. I was not an experimental physicist, but I just thought it was a really, really interesting problem. I thought it was a problem where we could make a lot of progress with a couple of simple, direct experiments. And I think back on that, and I think it was crazy to do that. I had no right thinking that I could enter into a field I knew basically nothing about. And yet it ended up being, the smartest thing that I ever did. And it not only rejuvenated my interest in science, it gave me a belief in the importance of, not staying in your comfort zone and the ability to do something new. And it also allowed me to, as I've gone on in my career, to still at heart, I'm a neuroscientist, but to have this interest in the sort of the hardware of the world, the skeletons, the muscles, the wings, the legs, how they interact with the world, this topic of biomechanics. I mean, if my postdoc had gone well, I never would have started studying, flapping wings in giant tanks of sugar or mineral oil. And so it was clearly a success that came from a failure.
This sounds like an incredible experience, your time in Germany, and just even the lessons you were able to learn in science, really taking on this whole new field of getting an appreciation of the biomechanics, learning about the muscles, learning about the bones, learning about how everything fits together in a nice package, as well as some of these life lessons, like, getting out of your comfort zone, getting inspired to get back into science, and learning laundry. I think that's a key life skill right there. So wonderful to hear about this failure that you were then able to transform into a success and really build your career off of. That's phenomenal. Now, I know a lot of scientists spend quite a bit of their time doing research, staying really busy in the laboratory, and it doesn't always leave a ton of time to enjoy a good book and relax necessarily. But I've gotten so many fabulous book recommendations from scientists, so I'm going to ask you for one today, Michael. Can you tell us about a book that you've read and really enjoyed?
I have so many, so I'll just go to the most recent one, which was Rick Atkinson's An Army at Dawn, which he won the Pulitzer Prize for about 10 years ago, which is the story of the Allied invasion of North Africa in World War II. So I love reading history. I don't actually read that much science when I'm not working.
Understandable.
And I read history, and military history in general I find very fascinating. So James McPherson, who wrote The Battle Cry of Freedom, is one of my heroes. Richard Rhodes, who wrote The Making of the Atomic Bomb. And Rick Atkinson, who wrote the Liberation Trilogy, of which An Army at Dawn is the first book. It's just a fantastic book, sort of transforming a historical event that you either know nothing about, or if you did know something about, you didn't really know.
Right.
And it's not like I'm by any way into war, in particular, but, ever since Herodotus, historians have used descriptions of war as a way of describing culture and times and norms. And I think that tradition continues. So I think Atkinson's book is really excellent.
Well, great recommendations. I think a lot of scientists that I've been chatting with, I've been surprised at how many people do have an interest in history and art and other things as well. So great to get one of these non-science book recommendations as well. So I will put that out there on our website under the resources tab for listeners to check out. And I know we chatted a little bit about your experience in Germany for what we'll call postdoctoral research. And I think a lot of scientists get some great opportunities to travel and to see the world for different occasions, maybe to go to conferences, maybe for these training opportunities, or even to work with collaborators, things like that. Can you think back now, Michael, on all of these places that you have traveled for science, and tell us about your favorite place?
That's very tough. I mean, you already mentioned the Max Planck. So certainly for, that time in my life, it was certainly the most informative place. But as I was thinking about this question, I think I'm going to give another answer, which is actually Organ Pipe National Monument. So I am not a field biologist, although I'm sort of a field biologist wannabe. I have dark, evil plans for doing work in the field. But this would be well over a dozen years ago now. I went with a graduate student and a postdoc to collect flies. And there's a whole bunch of species of fruit flies that are specialized to living in the deserts of southwestern North America. And he was interested in working on these flies. So this is not the sort of standard Drosophila that you can just get from the Bloomington Scout Center, right? So you have to really collect them, and they can only eat certain things. And so it was a field expedition right on the Mexico border. And it really transformed my view of the animal that I work on. And I think ever since that time, a philosophy in the laboratory has really been to consider these little guys, Drosophila, not as sort of models. As I say, it's maybe a little cheesy, but Drosophila is a great model for flies, right? I mean, they have a remarkable natural history. The group, the genus to which they belong is extremely species rich. They're extraordinarily good at what they do. And when you see fruit flies making a living in this inhospitable region of the world, really, including Death Valley, it just transforms your image of them. They're not these little puppy dog-like things that are buzzing around a little milk bottle in the laboratory, but they're really living on the edge out there. And
gives you a greater appreciation. I like that. Yeah.
I'm kind of dying to try to figure out a way of actually getting, money to spend more time in the desert studying fruit flies, doing what fruit flies actually do.
So I know a lot of scientists who work predominantly in the lab do aspire to do a field research or to be able to go out there and collect samples. So how long were you out there in the Southwest, in the desert, trying to collect fruit flies for?
We were there for a week, I think, and the project never went anywhere. We collected all these flies, and it turned out they were pretty hard to work with back in the laboratory. So it wasn't a case of this leading to some great scientific success, but it was a case of, transforming the way that I think about these animals. And that's a pretty profound thing.
Certainly. And it's something that I myself have never really thought about. And I think a lot of us, when we think about fruit flies, you either think about them in the lab or just kind of buzzing around your kitchen, being an annoyance. Great to envision them more in this sort of rugged environment, living on the edge, as you described, trying to find food, things like that. And I feel like I have a better appreciation for fruit flies now. And Michael, I think when a lot of scientists look back over the different places that they've traveled for science, the different groups that they've worked with, a lot of what makes your career so wonderful, a lot of what makes your day-to-day so exciting are some of the people that you get to work with. And I think when you look back over these different groups of people that you've worked with over the years, you remember a lot of the quirky traditions or maybe the funny memories that you shared with people at these different places. So can you tell us today about maybe a quirky tradition that you participated in, or even just a funny science memory that you have?
Yeah, so I'd have to say a couple things come to mind, but they really relate to the culture within my lab.
Sure.
And so, we have a couple of traditions every year. I mean, sometimes it doesn't work out, but more often than not, every year we try to take a lab camping trip. So the whole lab goes out and spends several nights at some lovely location. We've been to Lassen National Park, Lake Tahoe, the Redwoods, Sequoia National Park, and so forth. And that leads to some kind of crazy traditions. We play this game every time, kind of pantomime game called Location, Occupation, Mode of Death, that has led to some interesting memories through the years. But the one thing that sticks out is this time that we all went on a long hike one day. And it was the day we saw a naked hiker.
Oh, wow.
We were, kind of going up, and we were just stopping for water. And all of a sudden coming down the trail was this very sort of fast-moving, proud fellow in hiking boots and absolutely nothing else. And it was just one of those surprising things. Sort of anyone from that era of the lab, all you have to do is say, naked hiker, and everybody remembers that particular moment. The other thing that I should mention is that I have this thing about Hello Kitty, and in a really deep way that I can't quite understand. But unfortunately, sort of the news is out about this, and I occasionally receive anonymous packages with Hello Kitty things in them. And sometimes when I go on trips, I get Hello Kitty'd, which means that usually with Hello Kitty duct tape, everything in my laboratory gets transformed into sort of Hello Kitty land.
Well, that is amazing. So do you ever find the perpetrator?
Well, I won't mention the name, but just very recently, somebody has confessed that they were at least one of the Hello Kitty mailers. And it was very surprising because it wasn't who I suspected. So
really? It's the quiet ones you got to watch out for, right? Well, that is wonderful. Michael, it sounds like you have some great traditions in your laboratory. And I love this description of being able to go camping with your graduate students and your postdocs. Do you bring your ukulele along?
Yes, I do. Ever since I started playing, I bring my ukulele. And sometimes people bring other instruments. But, a lot of it basically involves around eating and drinking beer and just sitting around the campfire and things like that.
Certainly. Well, that sounds like a great opportunity for your students and postdocs to kind of hang out, enjoy each other's company, get to know each other, and certainly some of these bizarre things that just happen when you're together in groups like Naked Hiker, things like that, that you can always look back and laugh about. So wonderful to hear about these traditions. And I think the Hello Kitty is something new, something I've not heard of before. So interesting to hear that people have maybe caught on to one of these pet peeves, one of these quirky things that you strongly dislike, and how it keeps kind of getting flooded back into your life. So very interesting to hear about some of these traditions, some of these memories in your own life. And I think a lot of scientists, you talk about the memories that you've shared together, but you also talk about some of these big research questions that you hope to answer someday. Maybe some of these discussions that you have around the campfire, just some of these questions that you would love to be able to decipher, to decode, but there might be things standing in your way. Things like funding and staff and technology, maybe even feasibility. So can you tell us today, Michael, if we took away all of these constraints, what is one research question that you are just dying to know the answer to?
Yeah, again, the problem is it's hard to focus on just one.
Is there no simple answer? Yeah,
there's no simple answer. But I think I'd say the aspect of your question that I'm focusing on is this issue of sort of if you had the resources. So I think that one of the issues with particularly neuroscience is we are all pressured to work more intently on a smaller number of model systems, these genetic model systems, mice and flies and nematode worms and so forth. And I think one of the things that has been lost is interest in comparative systems and evolution. And I think if I had unlimited resources, if I was a Max Planck director or something like that, I would like to put more effort into studying the evolution of behavior and therefore spend some resources that are not specifically not working on fruit flies. Because I think to me, this isn't so much a burning question as I could phrase it as a question, but it's more of an image. So a term that I've used recently in some talks and a paper I wrote is something I called the Devonian toolkit. And what I mean by that is I'm trying to envision this is kind of metaphorical, but that first insect that crawled, out of the sea, when insects emerged onto land, what was its brain like? What was that sort of toolkit of behaviors that it needed in order to survive? And I think you could ask that about vertebrates. You could ask that about any group. You could ask it about life, really. And I think that in many ways, animals are really still living with their Devonian toolkit. That obviously a lot has changed since insects emerged, and a lot has changed since fish evolved and so forth. But I think that a lot of the core processing regions of the brain were there way back then. And I think that one of the most interesting questions is to try to reconstruct what that creature was like and sort of trace all current extant animals with any group back to that sort of creature. And some of my colleagues who I admire, like Nick Strausfeld and Paul Katz, try to work on these problems. And they're very, very difficult problems to work on. But if I had more resources, I think I'd try to focus on these evolutionary questions.
That is a fascinating area of study. Some really interesting questions buried in there in terms of what is this early toolkit for survival like? If you could just get a glimpse of that and what happened from there, being able to almost track it through time, how things have changed. And I think that is a really fascinating area of study, particularly from this neuroscience perspective, wondering what were they working with in terms of brain controlling all these different things as they were emerging onto land, as all these changes were happening in terms of behavior. So fascinating questions to ask. Now, I know we've had some great discussions today, and I love to have our guests leave our listeners with a piece of inspiration or maybe one piece of advice. So can you tell us today what you think is a great piece of advice or maybe one inspiring statement that you can share with our listeners today?
Don't stay in your comfort zone or don't be afraid to leave your comfort zone. I think not just for scientists, but we struggle between these two bounds of feeling, learning skills, whether they're social skills or scientific skills or, skills in anything, and, wanting to keep applying them at one extreme. And the other extreme is just moving on to the next thing. And I think, obviously you can have a successful life with any sort of strategy, but I think generally it's usually harder for people to leave their comfort zone, to sort of have the courage to try something new. But I feel that certainly within science, I think that the sort of science you can do, the richness comes from interdisciplinarity and being able to approach problems using different tools or to approach, different problems. So I think get out of your comfort zone is the advice that I would suggest.
Certainly. Well, Michael, that is wonderful advice. I think there are so many rewards out there or just rewarding experiences that you can have if you take the time to venture out of your comfort zone. It might be a struggle sometimes because I know, taking that risk, taking that leap can be challenging, but wonderful advice for our listeners. Now, can you tell them how they can reach out to learn more about you or your research?
Sure. One thing I can recommend is if people want to learn a little about flies and fly brains, and even some of the people that I've mentioned, they can go to a TED Talk that I did about a year and a half ago called How Flies Fly. So that's a very quick, relatively painless way of learning something about flies. And people can contact me at Flyman, FLYMAN, at Caltech, CALTECH.edu.
Wonderful. Well, listeners, feel free to check out that TED Talk. Reach out to Michael if you have any particular questions. And Michael, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your story.
Thank you, Marie.
Absolutely. This has been a pleasure. And thank you to our listeners out there. Join us again next time for another episode of People Behind the Science. Your voyage to the lives of today's exceptional scientists has just begun. You can find everything we talked about today, including our guests' favorite books, biographies, photos, and more, when you visit us at www.peoplebehindthescience.com. I look forward to seeing you next time on People Behind the Science.